Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the few slides that I've got to take you through this afternoon. So I called this a journey through the levels because, as Joe said, absorption costing takes us right the way through from level 2 to level 4. And one thing I want to try and do today really is make the links for you, because the way the AAT syllabus works, we add on extra levels of knowledge at each level until we get to level 4. And then by the end of level 4 and that synoptic, we have to pull the whole thing together. So let's not at level 2 or level 3 treat these techniques as isolated silos. Let's try and link all these bits of knowledge together and make sense of the whole thing. Let's look at the big picture. So let me take you to my cloud that is absorption costing. And effectively, this is what I'm going to cover in today's session. Moving round my cloud here, starting off with cost cards there in the top left-hand corner. Well, what this is, of course, is a list of resources that we need to do something, whether it's an activity, whether it's to make a unit of a product, whether it's to provide a unit of a service. So students at level 2 will be introduced to what a cost card is and how we will complete one. But of course, within that cost card, we'll see there are some indirect costs lurking, some overheads. And the thing with overheads, of course, is they're not specifically related to anything we do. They're things that are incurred by a business for everything a business does, not one individual product, not one individual service. So somehow with absorption costing, we want to make a link between a cost that is indirect and a unit of product, service, or an activity. So how do we do that? Well, we calculate, don't we, at level 2, an overhead absorption rate. We basically take our bucket of overhead costs and we divide it through by a budgeted level of activity to ultimately come up with a means to charge a share of these overheads to what we're doing. But what activity do we choose? Simply, we can choose the next 3 bubbles. We can go for the simplest approach of all, which is to divide through by the total units we're going to produce or we're going to provide if we're a service industry across all of our range of products. And we get an amount of overhead per unit, and that will help us complete that cost card. But if we want to be a bit more accurate, maybe we could instead choose to use machine hours or labor hours, but more on that on a later slide. So they're the 3 activities that we can use to help us create a simple overhead absorption rate. But how do we get to that budgeted cost? Well, level 3 picks up the story, and level 3 will show us how to create cost centers and then how to allocate and apportion indirect costs into those cost centers so that we can start to make sense of them. We also at level 3 learn how to reapportion. After all, some of our cost centers are production related. They're the ones that we want to focus on. They're the ones that we want to get all the costs into to calculate our overhead absorption rate. But we've also got service cost centers. They're there to support production. So we will need to reapportion some costs that we've allocated and apportioned from the service centers to production. Once we've got everything in those production cost centers, we can then calculate our overhead absorption rate. But lurking within level 3 then is this thing called an under or over absorption adjustment. We're basically testing how reliable our overhead absorption rate is. That, of course, is based on budgets. But what we want to do periodically is check how good our prediction of the overhead absorption rate was to what has actually happened. That gives us this under or over absorption adjustment. But by the time we're up into maybe the level 3 synoptic, because of course that's got some written elements to it, but certainly up into level 4, we need to be able to explain what we do with that figure. Now that altogether is a different level of knowledge. And then finally, well, it's as easy as ABC may be, but activity-based costing is just an extension of absorption costing, making it a little bit more detailed, trying to give us a bit more of a realistic edge, a bit more of an accurate edge than the simpler absorption method that we typically learn about at level 2 and level 3. So that's where we're going with it. Let's get onto that cost card. Let's see what's going on within that on my next slide. So here we are. We have a cost card. Why have I called it a recipe then? Because, hey, that's what it is. It's a recipe, isn't it? Of the ingredients needed to do something, whether it is an activity, whether we're a manufacturer and it's a unit of product, or if we're a service provider and it's a unit of service. The ingredients, what resources do we need? How much of them do we need? And what are the cost of those resources? Now, there might be a question pinging out on Facebook for you to consider here. What do we call, what name do we give to the total of materials, labor and expenses, which we would refer to as being direct cost? Direct, because there's an obvious link between that resource and what we're actually doing. We can measure it, hence my scales that have been put in there. But of course, AAT exams are littered with terminology. So my question is, what is the sum of the direct costs, otherwise known as? I'm just going to pause for a few seconds while you can contemplate that before I give you the answer. Those of you that went for the option of a prime cost, bang on. That's what it is. Prime costs, sum of the direct costs. So if you come across that in your exam at level 2, level 3, or even the synoptic at level 4, don't be thrown by it, because you now know what it actually relates to. So materials, labor, expenses, direct costs, prime costs, they are easy to charge to our units of product or units of service. We can accurately measure them. But what about the question mark there at the bottom? What about these indirect costs? How do I make a charge to my product or service for something where there is no obvious link? That at level 2 is pretty much where our journey starts. So we need to calculate an overhead absorption rate. There at the top of my slide, imagine my bucket full of overhead costs, production overheads, of course, predominantly our AAT exam focuses on. My formula there to work out my overhead absorption rate, take my budgeted overhead costs, the total of that bucket there, and divide it through by what I think is my budgeted activity. What's my activity then? The simplest one to go for is units. I add up all of the units of product or all of the units of service that I think I'm going to produce in the next period, and the sum total I divide into my budgeted cost. I now have an overhead absorption rate. I have a means to charge a share of that bucket to my individual products or individual services or activities. Job done. I can complete that cost card. But hang on a minute. If you think about it, by using that particular method, don't you just end up, regardless of the product, regardless of the service, don't you just end up with exactly the same amount of overhead being charged to each product or each service? And if you think about that a bit further, if you are a manufacturer, product A, B, and C, for example, if product B takes twice as long to make as product A, it's spent twice as long in the factory, twice as long having the benefit of all those resources included within your bucket of overheads. Why shouldn't it get twice the overhead charge? Wouldn't that be more logical? So to overcome that, we can use labor hours or machine hours instead. The budgeted production time that the machines are running for, or that the workforce is working for. So that gives us an hourly absorption rate. So now all of a sudden, with my products A, B, and C, if B does take twice as long, it will end up being charged with twice the amount of overhead. I've managed to successfully weight my overheads to my products. So at level 2, this is what we are asked to do. We're asked to remember a formula. Formula, is that really a formula? I've seen far worse in my time. Budgeted cost over budgeted activity. We have to choose the appropriate activity. So if we're making multiple products, providing multiple services, I would suggest we're looking really at labor hours or machine hours to get a more accurate reflection of the amount of resource being consumed by our products. Labor hours or machine hours, it comes down to simply how the workplace is set up. If it's a manually intensive process, it makes sense to make the charge using labor hours. If it's automated and there's not much labor hours at all, well, surely it makes more sense to work out a machine hour rate. So armed with our calculated overhead absorption rate, we can go back to our cost card. We've now measured the charge for materials, for labor, and for direct expenses. We've got our, yeah, you got it, prime costs, and now we have our overhead absorption rate to add into there to give a share of our indirect costs, and bang, we've got our production cost. What's the importance of that production cost? Surely we're basing all of our decisions on that thing. We are basically working out our prices for our products and services on that production cost. We are working out how profitable our different products are. So when you do these calculations to work out overhead absorption rates, there's more riding on it than you think. Get the method wrong, and all of a sudden your production cost is wrong, which means your price is wrong, which means you're sat there with a store full of stuff that nobody wants to buy because it's too expensive. And if you can trace that back to your costing being inaccurate, big problem. So level 2, that's essentially what we're doing. But let's take the story up to level 3. We can't forget that sort of stuff. We've got to remember it because it's important. We're going to use it as a management accountant day to day. But just remembering that overhead absorption rate calculation, budgeted cost over budgeted activity. I've looked at the activities. Where does the cost come from? So here at level 3, you are highly likely to get a question in your exam on apportionment and allocation. What are we doing? We're making sense of our costs. We're trying to get our indirect costs into cost centers so that we can perform our absorption rate calculations. So I've just got a simple example here to show you how it works. I've set up 4 cost centers, and definition, of course, what's a cost center? A collecting place for costs. That's fairly obvious, isn't it? What do we use them for? Well, we use them to help control our business at the end of the day, but also to do this sort of stuff, because from the information collected in our cost centers, we can produce calculations that help us to cost up what we're doing. So I've got 4 cost centers, 2 of which are production related. These are the hands-on people. These make products or provide services. And then I've got 2 what I call service cost centers. They don't make products, they don't talk to customers, but they're there to support the production part of the business. So I have just 2 indirect costs. These things are the cost of resources that ultimately I need to allocate or apportion to my cost centers. So let's start with allocation. What does it mean? Allocation basically means that you've got a cost and it's pretty obvious where it belongs. Yeah. So here we've got labor as an example, and down there on the right hand side of the slide, you can see a table, and we're just marking that up. We are given the wages costs basically of indirect workers in those cost centers. So we know where they belong. So we can just allocate the costs straight in to the cost centers. So production A, a £6,000 wage bill for its indirect workers. Remember, the direct workers have been taken care of. We've already charged them off to our products. Production B, £8,000 is the wage bill. For the canteen, £1,000 for the canteen staff for this period, and for maintenance, £3,000. So allocations, relatively easy to do. We know the cost belongs there. But what about costs that the business incurs that are effectively shared? So I've just summarized a whole load of them under a heading of facilities. But within facilities, you'll have things like the rent of the office. Now, the office is occupied by everybody. So if we are wanting to charge a fair share of the office costs to our cost centers that inhabit that building, how would we do it? Well, we would use a logical statistic. And a logical statistic for something like facilities costs has got to be the area occupied. It's a reasonable way of charging a reasonable amount of the rent of the office, the rates of the office, security costs of the office, even general energy costs of the office to the different cost centers. So our buildings people will know the area occupied by the different departments. They can measure it. And here on our table on the right-hand side, we can see we have the statistics. These sort of things are provided to you in your exam. So we can see that 40% of the building is occupied by production A. So 40% of the £10,000 bill will go to production A, £4,000. I've made the numbers easy, just to make life easier for myself, but don't forget to take your calculator to the exam. 30% of the building is occupied by Department B. So 30% of our facilities cost, £3,000, is going to end up there. Just 10% of the building is occupied by the canteen, so they can be charged with 10% of the overall bill. And finally, 20% of the building is occupied by the maintenance people. So 20%, £2,000, can be apportioned to maintenance. So these are how apportionments work. We look for a logical way to share that cost over all of our cost centers. So once we've done that, it's simply a matter of adding up and seeing where we are. So on that basis, production A has got £10,000 worth of indirect costs sat in it. Production B, £11,000. Our canteen, £2,000 of indirect costs. And finally, maintenance, £5,000. So we're on our way towards our formula for calculating an overhead absorption rate. But what I need to do next is get all of my costs associated with production. Then I can leap to my link to working out an absorption rate to charge a share of those overheads into what production are up to. So what I want to do next is reapportion, recharge basically the service centers to production based on the services they are providing to the rest of the business. Now, my example here, the recharge mechanism is shown there in the middle of our table. But let's take them in turn. Let me take the canteen. How would I recharge the services of the canteen to the rest of the business? Well, what does the canteen do? They feed the staff. So therefore, it would be reasonable to work out a charge based on the number of people in each department. We can see that on our table. So we can see there that we've got 11 staff in total that are employed. 2 of them, however, work in the canteen. So we can ignore those 2 people for our recharge. Otherwise, we'd end up charging the canteen with their own services, which seems a bit mad, really, doesn't it? So we're left with 9 staff, 4 of whom work in production A. So our ratio or our fraction, 4/9 of the workforce work in production A, excluding the canteen. So surely they should be charged with 4/9 of the cost of the canteen. 4/9 of £2,000 gives us roughly, we'll avoid decimal places, £889. So we recharge from the canteen to production A. 2/9 of our workforce, excluding the canteen, work in production B. So 2/9 of the canteen's cost will be charged to production B. 2/9 of £2,000, £444. Finally then, 3 people work in maintenance. So 3/9 of the workforce, excluding the canteen, work in maintenance. 3/9 of the £2,000 total will be charged to maintenance. I make that 667. Now, before anybody asks any questions about roundings for exams, read the information provided by the examiner carefully. They will tell you how to round things, okay? So what I've managed to do is reapportion, recharge basically the whole of the canteen's cost to the rest of the business. The canteen is empty of cost. I just now need to deal with maintenance. How do I charge maintenance's costs to the rest of the business? Well, typically I'm looking for what maintenance does for the rest of the business, and if I can measure if you like, the budgeted services they provide, I can do this reapportionment. So we're told here that maintenance spends 60% of its time supporting production department A, 40% of their time supporting production department B. So what I want to do is recharge the £5,667 that are in maintenance. I want to recharge it to A and B. So 60% of that 5,667, which again, if I round the answer, I think is about £3,400, goes into department A. The rest, 40%, 2,267, goes to department B. Nothing's going to the canteen. I've recharged maintenance. I've recharged the canteen. All of my costs are now in A and B. I can just add them up to get my total indirect costs in those 2 cost centres. So for production A, the £10,000 that I'd allocated and apportioned, plus the recharges from the canteen and maintenance, give me a total of 14,289. If I do the same for production B, I end up with 13,711. Now, the method that I've demonstrated here, even though I didn't really need to know that that was the name of the method because of the way the information had been provided, that is the step-down method of reapportionment. Those level 3ers amongst you will know that there are 3 different methods I can choose to reapportion a service centre cost. I can go for the simplest, the direct method. How does that differ to what I've done here? Well, basically, all I would do for each service centre is recharge all of their costs straight to production. So in my case here, I wouldn't recognise that the canteen supported maintenance, and I wouldn't make a recharge from the canteen to maintenance. I would just recharge the canteen's cost straight to production A and production B based on a ratio of their staff. That's the direct method. I've done the step down method, the reciprocal method, one that you need to be aware of, but you're not going to be examined on at level 3. The reciprocal method basically is the most accurate if you're ever asked. Why? Because basically we end up recharging each service center to every other cost center they support. And we keep going round in circles until ultimately we end up with all of our costs in our production centers. But there is a basic idea of cost center allocation and apportionment. It helps us to get the budgeted cost that we can now use to complete our formula to work out our overhead absorption rate. So let's go on to the next slide. There we are. We now know our budgeted costs. So for example, for production department A, I know the budgeted indirect cost, 14,289. All I need to do now is to decide the most appropriate activity to divide through by to work out for production department A to work out its overhead absorption rate. So if it makes multiple products, for example, then I'm not asking myself, well, is A labor intensive, in which case I'd use labor hours, or is it automated, in which case I would use machine hours. So from level 2, just being able to apply that formula, we've gone to level 3 where we go backwards a bit, if you like, work out how we get the budgeted cost, and then we apply the formula. So again, that enables me to complete my cost card for my product or my service, those measured prime costs, plus what I've calculated using my allocation, apportionment, reapportionment, and then my method of absorption. I've absorbed in a share of those indirect costs. I've got my production costs. I can now make my decision. So level 3 now introduces this comparison. I've got my overhead absorption rate. I'm using it to make decisions, including price. Surely I would need to check now and again how reliable my overhead absorption rate is, because it will make a difference to my decisions if it's wrong. So I do this under or over absorbed calculation. Now, what I do effectively, and again, there should be hopefully a question pinging out on Facebook for you to have a look at here, some question data. I've got budgeted costs, I've got budgeted units, I've got actual units, and I've got actual costs. And effectively, the question going on here is, what is my overhead absorption rate from that calculation? Can we apply that formula? And then we can work out our overhead absorption rate, and I can take you through this under or over absorbed calculation. Some of you may have worked it out already, but let's move on to the next slide. Let's start filling in some numbers. So there's my question data. I've got my budgeted costs from doing my allocation and apportionment and reapportionment and everything else. I've decided simply to use units to work out my overhead absorption rate. So my overhead absorption rate then is going to be £100,000 divided by 10,000 units. So I work out an overhead absorption rate of £10. So for every unit I produce, every unit I provide, I'm going to charge £10 of overhead to it to add to those prime costs to be able to work out my overall production cost. So my absorbed overhead then is £10 times the actual level of activity I've achieved. Now here, my actual units I've managed to provide in the period are 9,000. 9,000 times 10, £90,000 of overhead I have absorbed. Now let's start putting a bit of a different slant on what this is. Look at that as an allowance. By my calculations to work out my overhead absorption rate based on my budgets, given what I've managed to do in the period, I've allowed myself to spend £90,000 on indirect production costs. What did I actually spend in the period on these then? Well, according to the information there and the data, 105,000. So I've allowed myself to spend 90,000 and then promptly gone and overspent my budget or my allowance. I have effectively under absorbed by £15,000. Now, what do we do with that? This is management accounting information. What do we do with it? We don't have to do anything with it, to be honest. But what it shows you is the accuracy of your overhead absorption rate, in this case of £10, which has been used to compile your cost card, which has enabled you to calculate the cost of your product or your service, from which you've made decisions about how profitable it is and also what price to pitch it at. So the bigger that under or over absorbed figure is, the bigger you've got a problem. The more you have to think, hang on a minute, do I need to change that £10? In this particular case, does it need to be more than £10? Maybe it should be £12 or something, or £11, because that way I would give myself a bigger allowance to cover the overheads, because let's face it, at the moment, it looks as though I'm not making the profit that I thought I was going to make. These are the sort of things that level 3 synoptic, level 4 papers, we might be being asked to actually interpret. Can we explain what that means? Now, of course, based on the fact that our £10 is based on budgets, two things we've budgeted for: the underlying cost of the overheads. Okay, so there's a question there. Did we spend more than that or less than that? If we did, why did we? Was there a one-off unexpected cost that next period will disappear, and therefore I don't need to worry that I've under-absorbed this time round? Or is there something a bit longer term, in which case maybe I do have to worry that I've under-absorbed and I might want to increase my £10? The other thing that I've assumed when I calculated my £10 is that I would produce 10,000 units. Well, I haven't done that, have I? I've only produced 9,000. That's another reason why I've under-absorbed. So my question now is, why did that happen? Was my budget a little optimistic? Was I never going to sell 9,000 units? Was there a blip? Did a machine break down? And now it's fixed. I'll be back up to 10,000 units, no problem. The 15,000 is providing management with information from which they can decide whether their absorption rate that has been used to cost their product needs to be changed. Explain all that in a level 4 exam and you'll blow the examiner off his chair, or her chair, I should say. So there's my under or over absorption. It comes in at level 3, it floats all the way through level 4, but of course at level 4, you've got to be able to explain absolutely everything you're doing and why you're doing it. So finally, here we are at level 4. Although, to be frank, the level 3 syllabus does have activity-based costing, or ABC, buried within the content. But certainly at level 4, for budgeting, for decision control, for the synoptic, we are expected to be able to understand what activity-based costing is. So very, very briefly, to give you a flavour, to give you some excitement for the whole thing, why have I split my one bucket of overheads into 3? Because ABC basically says, hang on a minute, just how realistic is it? How reflective is it that the charge you've worked out for an individual product or an individual service can be accurately reflected by an overhead absorption rate that is based on just labour hours or machine hours? Surely for a big business with a lot of overheads, with lots of different products and services that all require an incredibly different level of resources from the business, from that overhead cost base. Surely there's more to it than that. And surely we should work out a more accurate overhead absorption rate for each little area of the overhead base. So let's split the overheads up into what we call cost pools, cost centers, to be honest, in real life. Each cost center of a business provides a specific service, or more or less, to the rest of the business, or ultimately to customers. So within our overhead base, we split the bucket into smaller buckets. Each bucket represents a cost center or a cost pool. For that cost center, we basically analyze it. We find out what it is they do for the rest of the business, and we work out a more appropriate absorption rate for just them. It's still the same formula. It's still budgeted cost over budgeted activity, but the activity is specific to them. Then we can use all these different overhead absorption rates to basically make better charges to the products or services they are supporting. And for a big business, the difference in that final cost card can be material enough to make us change our mind about a lot of things. So ABC improves accuracy, a more reflective way to charge a reasonable share of overheads to what on earth is going on in the business. That is a journey through absorption costing, from, just learn a simple formula at level 2 and apply it, to be able to fully understand everything at level 4, and not only be able to perform the calculation, but to explain it to a non-accountant, to see the big picture. That is the key to success in AAT exams. Yeah, there's no easy ways to learn formulas. It's all about understanding what is going on. Formulas become, I always think, less formulas then and more common sense. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you some excitement for your studies.